The next person that I'm going to bring up, I have known, again, I'm a little over 50, but I've known this individual pretty much as long as I can remember. Mr. Snowden is a former Annapolis alderman, and a lifelong civil rights activist, starting with his protests that lead back to his high school days in the early 70s, which actually got him expelled. He founded the Dr. Martin Luther King Committee Incorporated and was instrumental in bringing a King Memorial right here to this campus. Mr. Snowden has had several positions working for Governor Harris Glendening, County Executive Janet Owens, and Maryland Attorney General Doug Gansler. He's going to be here tonight, coming up shortly, to talk about Dr. King's actions in the summer of 1963. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and give a warm welcome to Mr. Paul.
Actually, my task is to talk about the summer of 1963 leading up to the March on Washington. Before I do that, I want to acknowledge the county executive. Thank you for putting on this program. It culminates a week of celebration of the King holiday. Kiefer, you know, your uncle, I believe, Perrin Mitchell, was one of my heroes. And then anybody who wants to know the history of the civil rights movement, particularly in Maryland, you cannot know that history without knowing the Mitchell family. They played such an instrumental role in the civil rights movement. But I want to take the few minutes that's been allotted to me to share what it was like in 1963. In 1963, my mother, Kiefer, was 39 years old. She's 102 years old today. My mother has seen a lot in her lifetime. And in 1963, she was part of a generation that had to suffer the following indignities before August 28, 1963. If you lived in Annapolis, Anne Arundel County, or any other parts of this nation, you were often confronted with the fact that you could go into a restaurant but couldn't eat in that restaurant. You go to a clothing store but couldn't try on shoes or clothing. And Judge Duden, this is something you might be interested in, and certainly all judges should know this. Goes to the heart of why it's important to have a judiciary that reflects the community it serves. I did not know this fact, but it happened in 1963. It was common practice in Mississippi and southern states that when black people came to testify as witnesses in cases, they were never called by their last name. They were never addressed as Mr. or Mrs. or Miss. They were always called by their first name: John, Mary, Walter, or Boy. A woman who many have never heard of, her name is Mary Hamilton, did something in 1963 that reflected the spirit of the times. In 1963, while in a court case, the judge addressed her as Mary. The prosecutor addressed her as Mary. Her own lawyer addressed her as Mary, and she refused to respond. The judge told her, if you don't respond, I'm going to fine you in contempt, and he did. And he fined her $50. Her case was taken by the NAACP, went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and she won. And the reason that African American people today, like anyone else, is addressed by their surname is because of Mary Hamilton, a little known Supreme Court case that many do not know. In 1963, there were a lot going on in that year. In 1963, in a place called Birmingham, Alabama, a police commissioner by the name of Bull Connor, he met Martin Luther King Jr. for the first time And he told Dr. King something that became the classic example of what white supremacy is. He said to Dr. King in meeting him, it's a question of mind over matter. We don't mind and you don't matter. Dr. King understood that he was facing white supremacy and racism at its best. In June of that same year, 1963, Medgar Evers was assassinated. Medgar Evers was a NAACP field director. Coming home from a meeting, a sniper shot and killed him. He would be one of the first major assassinations in the country. In that same year, in June of that same year, Governor George Wallace stood in front of federal troops at the University of Alabama and refused to have black students enter the University of Alabama. In 1963, there were numerous demonstrations occurring all over the country. But then something happened in that year. Remember 1963, for those who are old enough to remember. This is before John Kennedy would be assassinated. This is before 4 of the girls would be murdered in September of that year. In 1963, hundreds, indeed thousands of black men, women, and children have been arrested. And Dr. King decided, along with what was called the Big Six, to call for a national demonstration. It was to be the largest demonstration in the history of the nation. But it was not the first time that there had been called for a national demonstration. It was first called for in 1944 by A. Philip Randolph, who was part of what's called the Big Six. In 1963, when Dr. King called for the March on Washington, a little known fact is that the Kennedy administration was not, I emphasize, was not supportive in the beginning of this demonstration. They actually advised against having the demonstration. In 1963, there was such concern that the National Guard was put on alert, the Army was put on alert, all liquor stores within a certain radius of Washington, D.C. was closed. And there was this great concern that having these many people come to Washington, D.C., no one knew what would happen on that occasion. As I moved to take my seat, of all the things I've learned about the civil rights movement, of course, of Dr. King, the one thing that stands out to me was the tremendous courage of people. There are men and women who gave the ultimate, whose names will never appear in any history book. There are men and women who went to their graves fighting for something that we collectively take for granted. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they have certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In a few moments, you're going to hear Dr. King eloquently address that theme. Thank you for your patience.